And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing we have one trough moving up and dissipating along the North Gulf Coast here as a low tracks up and really weakens as it moves across Kodiak Island into northeast Bristol Bay. Next system here to the south comes right up to the north there, east-southeast of Kodiak Island by tomorrow afternoon, mid-afternoon hours. Gale and storm force winds develop ahead of this system from Kodiak Island right on up into Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound. North Gulf Coast, winds on the increase along the coast of the Panhandle, especially the north coast there, but it should be a dry day tomorrow. Otherwise, pretty windy conditions here up over the western and northwest interior, especially continuing those strong northeast winds through the passes of the western Brooks Range. And then for the day Tuesday, that system moves up and really washes out there. A weaker low moves into the southern Panhandle for some light rain there. Otherwise, less wind and a lot drier here along the North Gulf Coast and all of southern Alaska with some scattered rain and snow showers around the area, and then quite an area of snow here from the eastern Arctic coast and the Brooks Range right on into the western interior, especially the Yukon Delta, through the Bering Sea, including the Pribilof Islands. That extends right on down into the central Aleutians. Coastal water forecast here for the southeast coast. For tomorrow, for the south coast, southeast winds 40 knots, and then we've got east winds 45 to 60 knots for the north coast. Southeast only 15 for Lynn Canal, but north 25, gusts 35 for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait. Southeasterlies at 25 knots. And for the day on Tuesday, variable winds 20 to 25 knots here for the south coast. North coast, south to southeast winds at 20 knots and southeast 15 for Lynn Canal. Southeast 20 for Stevens Passage. Gale warnings for Clarence Strait for southeast winds 35 knots and 12-foot seas. North Gulf Coast tomorrow, storm warnings. East to southeast winds 50 to as high as 65 knots with seas anywhere from 25 to 30 feet. Storm warnings in Prince William Sound east at 55 knots with 14-foot seas. Cook Inlet, storm warnings, as well as the Barren Islands for east to northeast winds 50 knots, and Kamishak Bay, the only place with gales, southeast at 45 knots, seas 16 feet. Then on the day Tuesday, Cook Inlet, not as windy, but still pretty good here. South winds 30 to 35 knots, south 30 knots, Kamishak Bay, and the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, pretty uniform. South winds at 30 knots. And for Kodiak Island, east winds 30 to 35 knots for Monday, east at 20 for Bristol Bay, and the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds at 20 knots. For the day Tuesday, we've got south to southwest winds here for the peninsula at 20 to 25 knots, southeast at 20 Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, southerlies at 30 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, north to northeast winds at 20 to 25 knots, north winds 25 knots for the central Aleutians, and out west, here we've got northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the day on Tuesday, north to northwest winds 25 to 35 knots there for the areas west of Adak all the way to Shemya. Central Aleutians west-northwest at 20 knots, and the eastern Aleutians west-northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots, northeast at 30 for St. Lawrence Island. Gale warnings for Norton Sound, northeast 35 knots. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, northeast at 40 knots, north at about 30 for the Pribilofs. Those drop off to 20 knots there for the Pribilof Islands on Tuesday. Gales hold here for St. Matthew Island out of the north at 40 knots, Norton Sound north at 30 knots, Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island north at 20, northeast 15 for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast. And for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast tomorrow, east at 15 knots, northeast winds for the central and western coast at 15 to 20 knots. Gale warnings for the Chukchi Sea, north to northeast winds 35 knots. And for Tuesday, Chukchi Sea, gale warnings, north to northeast winds 40 to 45 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the remainder of the Arctic coast for east to northeasterlies at 25 knots.